For my article, I chose changes in functional movement screen scores over a season in collegiate soccer and volleyball athletes, which was published in November of 2014 in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. The listed authors are Peter Sprague, Monique Mocha, and Dustin Grattens from Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Functional movement screening, or FMS, has become a mainstream thing lately for athletes. The basic purpose of FMS is to determine how athletes move when performing a variety of tasks in order to identify if they're at risk for injury due to movement deficiencies. The screening does not assess strength, power, or quickness, but rather how the athlete performs fundamental movements. There are 7 tests, including the deep squat, hurdle step, inline lunge, shoulder mobility, active straight leg, trunk stability push-up, and rotary stability. Each test is qualitatively assessed and given a score ranging from 0 to 3. A 3 indicates that the movement was completed as instructed and was free of compensation and pain. A 2 indicates the subject completed the movement pain-free, but with some level of compensation, whereas a score of 1 indicates the subject was unable to complete the movement as instructed. A score of 0 is given if the subject experiences pain during the movement. In this particular study, the authors wanted to see how FMS scores would change over the course of a competitive NC2A Division II collegiate season. The basic study design included a preseason and postseason assessment of the FMS on all of the athletes, which included men's women's soccer and also women's volleyball. A total of 57 athletes, 20 men and 37 women. The hypothesis was that the scores would, at a minimum, remain the same and that the frequencies of scores of 1 and asymmetries would decrease from preseason to postseason. I should note that in 5 of the 7 tests, the subject is assessed on the left side and the right side. Discrepancies in these scores represents an asymmetry. One aspect that I found interesting in the study is that the authors did not track injuries among the players, which is what's been done in the past with FMS. For example, determining if there is a correlation between low FMS scores and injury rates is the subject of a variety of research studies. But this study didn't do that. All the authors were trying to do was to see if engagement in training and competition has influence on FMS scores. Another interesting point before I get to the results of the study was that 2 of the 3 teams they monitored engaged in resistance training during the competitive season, while 1 team did not. The women's volleyball and women's soccer teams both did strength training, while the men's soccer team didn't. As you might expect, the in-season strength training program was pretty minimal for the 2 women's teams. Volleyball, for example, trained an average of twice per week at 50 to 60% of 1RM for the lower body and 60 to 70% for the upper body. The team did very little speed, agility, and quickness drills because of the, quote, inherent impacts incurred during training practice and competition, end quote. Women's soccer trained once per week, in which 70% of that time was spent doing resistance training at 65 to 80% of 1RM. The remaining time was divided between speed, agility, and quickness drills and plyometrics. In total, the women's volleyball team did 28 training sessions and the soccer team did 14. The men's soccer team, as I noted, did 0. The amount of training makes sense in relation to the number of competitions in that volleyball had 32 matches and soccer had 15, so it makes sense that soccer could train more frequently. But wait, you say this doesn't actually make sense, does it? Volleyball was a team that trained twice per week and they had twice the matches as soccer. So what gives? It's hard to say, and the actual lifts the athletes performed is not provided in the article, and I feel this is a real weakness of it. For example, were the athletes performing back squats or front squats? To what depth did the strength coach have them go? Did they do overhead squats or lunges or any other movements that were similar to movements assessed in the FMS? We all understand the specificity of training, so the question is the training done by this particular team similar or dissimilar to the FMS protocol? Happily, although the article is considered a weakness, you had the men's soccer team which did no resistance training. In a way, this group is a bit of a control, although I would argue that an actual control group would have been nice. The men's soccer team, if there were any changes in FMS scores, would have been due solely to sport practice. So what happened? Did the athletes score the same, better, or worse in FMS from preseason to postseason? The answer is mostly that they stayed the same. The total FMS score for each athlete remained relatively unchanged. There was no significant difference. However, for the deep squat and the inline lunge tests in particular, the scores did improve. But on the other hand, the active straight leg and the rotary stability scores got worse. My goodness, what happened? But the last piece of good news was that the researchers did find less incidences of asymmetries and less scores of 1. It's clear to me that the authors of this article like using the FMS and find some value in it. In fact, the first line of the discussion states, quote, "The FMS is an inexpensive, non-invasive, and efficient method of evaluating fundamental movement patterns." But here's my problem with the assessment. None of the tests have the athlete under any load other than his or her body weight. Any strength coach or personal trainer worth his salt understands that mechanics often break down when the load is added. We all know people who look pretty good doing a squat or lunge, but as soon as it gets a little heavy, the wheels fall off. And if we add power or velocity to the equation, watch out. All of the FMS tests are slow and controlled movements, which are in direct opposition to the movements most athletes make on the field or on the court. I understand that athletic trainers and physical therapists like the assessment. It provides an actual score that can be tested and retested. And if the clinician is good at doing the assessment, the scores are reliable. But here's my point. Is the test valid? Does it actually measure what it's supposed to? Is it actually telling me who's a good mover and who's not a good mover? Fundamental movement patterns have existed in the physical education realm for years, and they include locomotor skills like running, skipping, and hopping, and also manipulative skills such as throwing, catching, and dribbling. Rubrics exist to assess how students perform these skills, and assessment is common in grade school physical education programs. To my eyes, since I actually teach these rubrics to our PE students here at Appalachian, these skills are more rigorous than the FMS battery. But my point remains the same. With a myriad of different athletic skills necessary, there's no one test that can accurately predict success or injury rates. A coach still needs to be a coach and use all of his or her observational abilities to discover who has a chance to be successful and who still needs some additional cueing.